Welcome to the Block and Tackle Show, hosted by Karl Block. Karl is a partner in the law firm of Loeb & Loeb here in Los Angeles, California. He will be tackling some of the biggest issues in business today. Listen, learn, and enjoy as he leaves no stone unturned during deep conversations with some of today's most amazing business leaders. Welcome to the show.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's episode of the Block and Tackle Show. I'm very pleased to have as my guest Jason Child, who is the current CFO of Arm, the lead processor of IP and software design and development solutions. Jason has extensive experience as a CFO. He's had 5 CFO roles, and 3 of them have been in public companies. And even though he only looks 25, he definitely has had quite a rich experience. He's also on the board of directors of Coupang, a Fortune 500 e-commerce company. And he is most proud of, as he often reminds people, of being a UW graduate, which for those of you who may get confused about Wisconsin, this is University of Washington. And he currently serves on the business school, the Foster School of Business Global Advisory Board. Jason keeps it real. He's going to talk about a lot of his experiences, and I think you all in the audience are actually going to learn a lot today. But Jason, welcome to the Block and Tackle Show.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Good. So what I'd like to talk about, because you've worked in, to some degree, a who's who of companies, are your various experiences in some of the largest or some of the fastest growing companies in the world, and to talk about your thoughts about working there, the challenges to growth, and your likes and dislikes. So why don't we start with Amazon? Why don't you tell us about what the challenges were, what the challenges to growth were, and what you saw in terms of the culture being positive and what you might tweak?
Sure. So maybe just a little bit of context. When I joined Amazon it was late 98, early 99. The business was been public not quite a year and a half. It had only been in business about three and a half years. It was quite small. I mean, it was starting to get a lot of notoriety because of the dot-com boom, which was just taking off. I joined coming out of now Big Four accounting and consulting, and it was my first kind of operating role. I jumped in, and I think it was the first quarter that we'd hit $1 billion in revenue, and then over the next 12 years, I had a number of roles where we scaled to actually about 50 billion in revenue. So over 12 years, kind of just had a chance to see scaling, by 50x, but 50x starting at $1 billion, which is pretty unusual. I would say it was without a doubt the single best education I could have ever received. Basically being in the kind of the front row of seeing all the lessons, and typically when a company like Amazon, who now has of course done very, very well, revisionist history mostly just looks at all the successes. But you probably remember right after I joined, I think some periodical called it Amazon.con, because they said the business would never make money, and it was all just some sort of a Ponzi scheme selling dollars for 85 cents. One called it Amazon.org because it was never going to make money. It was just a nice big not-for-profit. Anyway, so now obviously things have changed a bit, and I think while there's so many things we got wrong in the early days, eventually I think the company, and especially Jeff Bezos and the senior team, learned from mistakes better than anyone I've ever seen. Kind of had this general approach of you can try bold things and make mistakes, just don't make the same mistake twice. And so I felt like the everything I experienced and saw there was very much influenced, as I've told some of my friends, it kind of mutated my DNA and how I solve problems, how I think about business, how I think about taking bold some sort of a bold step on whether it's a career or personal thing, whatever. Amazon just has had so much influence on how I approach things.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there. First, when it came to segueing from consulting into actually doing, how hard was that transition for you?
Well, I think it's hard for anyone. I think it was honestly, I felt like I was an okay consultant, and I was a decent, I was a CPA, and I didn't, I liked accounting, but I didn't love accounting. And so I felt like, if you really love, kind of a fairly rigid set of rules and really sticking close, really like in technical accounting, I was never that great at technical accounting. So when I was controller at Amazon, the first thing I did was make sure we have an amazing technical accountant who could actually cover my blind spots. Because I get bored with reading, 50 pages of detail on whatever the latest RevRec standard is. And so for me, it actually was like, wow, this was what I was meant to do. All of a sudden I went from having worked in, I'd say Big Four accounting where, I liked some of my clients. I tended to look at my watch, quite often, to all of a sudden, like I look at my watch and, oh crap, it's almost 7. I'm going to get yelled at by my wife if I don't get home, but because I've got so much more I want to do and go after. So for me, it was hard in terms of just, certainly it's a different set of muscle and skills that you got to build, but it was just so much fun moving from, advising to operating.
I mean, I would assume that there's some comfort when you advise because you're really not, your decisions are not, quote, on the line, but to being, an operator where they are. And
I would say I slept a lot better advising because the problem could just kind of go away after a glass of wine and I just go to bed. Whereas when you're operating, especially when it was in e-commerce, where you're selling around the clock globally, something's breaking every minute. You kind of know that when you go to bed, there's a certain set of problems, and when you wake up, there'll probably even a different set of problems. And so there's a certain level of stress, but also a certain level of excitement that comes with that environment.
That makes sense. The other thing, one of the other things that you said is I think for people who haven't worked in the public company space, some of them think that the larger public companies, they never make mistakes. But I think that growth is disruption and companies make mistakes, and the ones that do the best, they actually learn from them. And to your point, you don't make the same mistake twice, but even if you only made it once, you can learn a lot from what you did, right?
100%. And, there's definitely a public company CFO code that we don't violate, but very rarely does every quarter just land exactly the way it was supposed to when it started. And, I think anyone knows in those type of roles, your job as a business leader, as well as a public company executive, is you have to have the list of what are the levers and things that you can control when the business, goes right instead of left and you have to react to it. And, part of the whole public company readiness thing is, do you even know what those levers are? And when you pull those levers, do you have some confidence that you can actually make sure you get the outcome that you need? And so there's a whole bunch that goes into all that stuff. And that's maybe, I don't know if that's a different podcast, but it's easy to say and quite hard to actually execute.
Understood. And without minimizing the role of the CFO, and you're a fantastic CFO, it's true for anybody in senior management. Things, whatever division or area that you're looking at, stuff goes wrong. You may misassess something and you have to work around that. And so, it sounds like that was a great learning experience for you about knowing what can happen, knowing, how to take the failure, turn it into an opportunity. That probably was a great experience for you.
Yeah, well, especially, if you think of the early, really the most fun probably of my career was, 99 to 2003, 4 timeframe, which was honestly when the .com crash happened. I joined a company. I think the stock was $75. It goes to 110 in the next year, and then it goes from 110 down to $6.50 over the next year. 70 some odd percent of the company gets up and leaves. And, those of us that said, great, where are you going to go? Because the whole thing has kind of come apart. So we might as well just figure this thing out and fix it and figure out how to survive and how to make this business do what the public markets are expecting us to do. And while that was incredibly hard, it was, it was exactly, it was like the kind of experience that very few people, I think, get to learn from and survive from. Because unfortunately, a lot of those types of experiences, like the .com crash, probably destroy, most of the people that are trying to deal with it. And there's not too many that survive. Same thing for the global financial crisis. Same thing for, as you know, every 8 to 10 years, we have something like this.
Understood. So before we move on from Amazon, are there any other specific takeaways that you'd like to share with other people about what you learned or how you incorporate into your leadership style from Amazon?
Sure. I would say maybe in maybe one simple sentence is you see all these taglines on vision eats strategy for lunch or this, that, and the other. The one that I personally experienced and fully believe is that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And that is, if you set a culture for a company on how to solve problems, on how to, how to basically work through any sort of a challenge or opportunity, that can beat out. I mean, that really can beat out most anything. Now, there's a few exceptions, like for example, Google AdSense. That's a pretty great model, and you could probably you probably have a lot of room on different cultures that would allow that to still thrive. But in my experience, it really is the culture. And for example, this Amazon culture of being able to, intense truth seeking, diving deep, just applying operational principles, that really allowed it to distinguish itself across many businesses is something that I would say was a huge learning and something that's very much impacted my career going forward. It wasn't as obvious to me then, but now, 5 jobs since, it's definitely become clear.
Listen, that makes sense. I mean, the strategy that you come up with may not always be executed the way you anticipate, and there may be roadblocks or whatever. So if you do have that culture of, we have to figure it out, we have to problem solve, we have to see whether we need to change the strategy or what we need to do to put it back on track, that only makes sense. So thank you for that. So then let's talk about a company that I think when it first really had great branding, people thought, wow, how come nobody ever thought about this before? And this is maybe the ultimate disruptor, and that's Groupon. So let's talk about your experience with Groupon, and again, what happened with their growth and what you learned about the culture and what you took from it.
Sure. So, it's been a while now, so maybe just to revisit a little bit about kind of what happened. But this business was created during basically the global financial crisis. It was created, I think, in November of 2008. So kind of right when everything was really, we were in a tough spot. The whole really the whole country, maybe even to some extent the whole world, was in a really tough spot. And so at that time, this new business Groupon launches, and by this 28-year-old, very eclectic, incredibly smart person. So who honestly kind of doesn't look that much different than a lot of genius founders that have now come out over the last, probably 15 or 20 years. And he certainly, fit that mold. I had met him when I was at Amazon. I'd been there about 12 years. I met him and I was like, wow, this is company is special. And they had, in 2 years, I met him when it was 2 years old. It went from 0 to about $700 million in sales, or I think that was GMV. So it was like $400 million in revenue, from 0 to $400 million revenue in 24 months. And that, at least up to that point, no business had ever grown that fast. I believe still to this day, even Uber, Airbnb, those guys, they still haven't eclipsed that number. I mean, it was a pretty incredible number. And so, and it was actually something even at Amazon. We were looking at Amazon going, wow, this could be the next really, really big thing. And so I somehow had a chance to talk to them about their CFO job, and they kind of famously shunned some acquisition offers rumored from Yahoo and Google. And so I joined right around that second anniversary, and then and the goal was the company was going to go public relatively soon, because not just because the company was growing so fast, but the capital needs were going to be significant. And so, really needed to go public. Now, what looks to be really, really early, back in the old days, i.e. 2010, 11, and pre, companies went public quickly, like Amazon. Amazon went public, I think, in 97, and it was only a year and a half old. That was the way things used to be. When you need capital, you go public. Now it's, you go public when you don't need capital and everything looks great. That's when you go public. But anyways, we go public, and in this first year, we expand from 1 to 48 countries. We grow from, we'll call it, like roughly 700 million or in sales to about 4 billion in sales, and we grow from about 1,000 employees to around 10 to 15,000 employees. So we do all that in this third year. And then, of course, we also go on file with the SEC. This was pre-Jobs Act. In fact, we were told that we were part of the inspiration for the Jobs Act, which basically allows you to file privately. And it was just kind of it became an example of all the things that could kind of go wrong, or weren't handled correctly, or whatever. And it was a fascinating experience. I learned a ton. I kind of joke that learnings generally are failures that you try to turn into something productive, and so the learnings were almost endless. And but ultimately, I talked a minute ago about why, what this whole Amazon concept of this culture eats strategy for breakfast. Well, Groupon was only by growing that quickly could that be done if you had a business idea or a concept that truly was remarkable, which it was. And so it grew. So in this case, you had an amazing model. And so now the key was, let's go surround a team of executives that have seen how to scale. And so myself, and then we hired some other folks, from some great executives from Amazon, and as well as some other great companies. And we really had a good culture. We had a really good team, and we had an incredibly hot product. However, what we basically found out was this product wasn't really durable in its current iteration. It was a 3-year-old business that it just hadn't been around long enough to be fully seasoned.
That makes sense. And I want to just jump in for a sec. So, obviously being at Amazon and you see rapid growth and you get it, you're there and you're around other super smart people. Mm-hmm. But to go to a company that, you have 1,400% growth in your employment base, and you're in 48 countries, and the integration of all those people, and not only just knowing what everybody else is doing, but knowing how people could collaborate, that sounds very, very, very daunting.
Yes, very daunting. It was interesting because you had, I think Mark Andreessen was one of the early investors, and he was on the board as a, whatever role, Mary Meeker and John Doerr, and the chairman of NEA, Peter Barris, was on the board. And all these people have had so much history, and they all said, yeah, we've never seen anything like this. The only reason it could grow that fast, honestly, this was one of the first examples of effectively web services where, because in the old world, you couldn't grow servers that fast. You couldn't actually scale operations. You just couldn't even go into 48 countries, from 1 to 48 countries in a year. Wouldn't be possible. And so, we were at some point, we were the biggest, Salesforce customer. We were the biggest AWS customer. We were the biggest Zendesk customer. We were the biggest, all these different platforms that certainly became quite large. It was great. They enabled us. The problem was no one really asked the question of, well, just because you can, does that mean you should? And I think, and so it ended up being a lot of the Ubers and the Airbnbs and a lot of those different companies, they all kind of came through the doors over the next 5 years and kind of, to try to say, wow, let's see if we can learn from this. And honestly, it did end up becoming in part one of the reasons why you saw, we were, I think, the first private round of $1 billion. That was done right after about the 2-year anniversary. At that point, no one had done anything anywhere close to that. $1 billion private round is now like that happens every month or two.
Sure.
Yeah, and so all these things were just like, it was the first for a lot of things. And so I would say, if nothing else, Groupon was a great example of stress testing, a whole bunch of things, and generally finding out probably why, going all the way to the limit maybe doesn't make the most sense.
No, and that is great. And honestly, I think we could probably unpack all of that in another podcast, but so we won't do that today. But let's talk about the one trick pony aspect of the product, which, I think people might be surprised how many companies with names actually do have this same issue, but you lived it.
Yeah.
So you find out that it's not durable, and then what are you guys confronted with, and what are you thinking about?
I mean, there's a long list of learnings. I mean, part of it is, so if you had to kind of just pull out some of the obvious learnings, the first one would be, if it's a consumer value proposition and it's only 3 years old, do you really understand, and do you really understand the customer behavior and how they view your value proposition?
Mm-hmm.
So for example, when the average cohort, we had 150 million subscribers at some point, but the average subscription timeframe was like 2 months on average. And of course you could say, well, let's go look at the early cohorts. And this is definitely something that VCs like to do. They take these, anything that has like a city or a market, that you can multiply in many, many places. It's like, go show the early cohort, go show how great it is, go show the early customers, create some curve, and then just say, all we have to do is stamp this out many, many, many other times. And, the reality is that that's not, I think it's a fun exercise, but the reality is it's way too simplistic on all the different dependent variables that actually affect things. In this case, the problem was, if you have so many customers buying so many Groupons, do you really understand at what point do they say, oh, if I have a year to exercise them and I bought a whole bunch and I go public before most customers have even had their first Groupon expire, do I know what's going to happen when they start to expire? So after we go public, we realize, oh shoot, we got a real problem here. I think we're finding out customers are really struggling with the expiration issue. We should probably create a trade-in program. So I go talk to the chief accounting officer. Oh yeah, you can't create a trade-in program. That changes our rev rec. That means you have to change all your terms and conditions. And no, you'd have to go private, fix all your terms and conditions, change your rev rec policies, and then spin back out. It's like, well, we just went public a few months ago. That's not really an option. And so things like that are just like, yeah. I mean, when you're moving fast, you're going to learn things that if you go public too early, you're not really, you thought you had a durable offering, but you didn't really have a durable offering. Then there's also things like the reason customers aren't using the Groupons as much is because printing them out or even having it show up on your phone and having to have a really seamless redemption experience isn't really that great. Well, I would say over a couple of years, we ended up building a great redemption experience. But the problem was that so many customers had already bought too many, didn't use them, and already kind of thought, I used it, I didn't really like it. Well, no, what you used was a totally different product than what we have now. And so it was a little bit of like, it grew too fast before the product really had all the technology, the process, and all the terms and conditions that really, really made it great. It grew too fast, and I think churned through enough customers and merchants, even though eventually built all the right features and tools to really make it work much better. But at that point, it was a little bit too late. So it's I don't know, really fascinating. I think, the nature of timing and having the right technology at the right time is certainly, that's where magic happens. And in this case, we didn't have the right technology at the right time. We eventually had the right technology, but it was probably a couple years too late. And even though we did everything we could and had the right culture and the right management team and the right technology to deliver those things, you now had to overcome the consumer perception and the merchant perception that everyone in the world had heard about, because there had been so many articles and so much press coverage on it. And that was very, very tough.
That makes sense. So, all right, there's a lot of people who their careers might have stopped just with those two experiences, and then you go to Splunk. So you come back up to the plate and you go to another tech firm. So let's talk about that. When you went to Splunk, it was a relatively more mature company than either when you started at Amazon and at Groupon. What did you find your early challenges were, and how'd you deal with them, and how did you overcome them?
So there was actually a couple of short roles that I had between Groupon and Splunk, and I think that was necessary and helpful just to get a little more time and distance.
PTSD from Groupon.
Well, I can tell you there was. I won't get into names, but there's some very high-profile companies that I talked to while I was departing Groupon that struggled with you seem like you have great experiences, and you seem like you have the right mentality, you seem like the exact right fit for this role. But I don't know, as a board member or as a, whatever, I just, Groupon had a lot of hair on it. And I just don't know that I kind of would rather, like, if you were just coming from Amazon, I'd be really excited to hire you. But now, now that you had this other stop in between, even though you probably learned a lot more and you're probably maybe even more equipped, I just don't know if I want to deal with saying that I hired the CFO that came from Groupon. That was a problem. That was a legitimate problem.
I get it.
No question. So anyway, time generally heals those types of things, and ultimately, I mostly just focused on continuing to build my network, continuing to find the right types of exposures and things and whatnot. And so somehow I was lucky enough to come across the folks at Splunk, and here's a company that actually had the kind of opposite experience of Groupon. This would be the way you want an IPO to go. They actually went public only about, I think it was 5 or 6 months after Groupon. Whereas Groupon was a $12 billion stock after the first day, and I think went to $20 billion over the next couple months, and then fell to about a quarter of that in about a year. Splunk was a company that was $100 million in revenue. It had been around for, I think at that point it had been around 6-7 years. It had built a really, really good, unique, differentiated product. And it went public. It was expected to be about a $500 million IPO. It went public. It went to $1 billion quickly. And by the time I joined them in 2019, they were about a $16 billion company. And they just had this amazing, steady kind of growth rate. And they just kept delivering, kept being profitable and growing at a consistent, steady clip. It was more of the story you want to see when you see a company go public. So when I first heard from them, I thought, wow, this is really interesting. Here's a company that kind of had exactly the right experience. And so my first question was, well, why are they calling me? Well, the reason why was because they'd had a really, really good experience, but now it became clear that they had waited a bit too long to transition to the cloud. In fact, one of the things that was talked a lot about internally is a company that went public literally within a month or two of them, who was the exact same size, but was cloud native, was a company called ServiceNow. And they had the same size revenue, and they were valued about the same thing. And of course, today ServiceNow is a, 150 to $200 billion valuation company. And of course, Splunk just sold for sub 30 billion. Still a great outcome, but not ServiceNow. And one of the things at that time was they looked at early on is really should we focus on this whole cloud thing back in the early 2010s. And I think, the answer to that, there was still a lot of questions about whether or not security was going to be appropriate in the cloud. Would it really scale right? Is the right thing? And so just the nature of the Splunk product was, no. We are an on-prem product. That is where the largest, biggest, most sophisticated environments are. So best security is. That's where we need to be. Well, by the time you get to 2019, it's pretty clear that that has now become an outdated approach. And so to be able to drive that transformation was going to require a lot of work across, business process, across, the tech and platform kind of pieces, even the go-to-market and sales motion, as well as all the financial aspects, because the two companies that had gone through that transition in the kind of 5 years prior were Autodesk and Adobe. And they kind of famously went through, I think they called it, if you looked on a financial chart, you'd see what they have before they transitioned, the valley of death or valley of despair or whatever. They didn't die, so it wasn't death, it was despair. Yeah. And then they came back out. And so over like a 3 or 4 year period, they came out better than they started, and the companies were worth a lot more and everything was wonderful. And so this company looked at, I see that valley. How are we going to deal with that? And so that's a different set of skills. And we need someone who's maybe got a little more risk tolerance and some more, some thoughts on how we can try to kind of drive that. And so, they had a relatively new CEO, and the new CEO, typically CEOs want their own CFOs. And so that's kind of what happened. So that was the setup. I would say, overall, generally it was I would say relative to maybe from a stock perspective, relative to Autodesk or Adobe, we probably did a better job, at least initially. And then eventually we hit some of the product and technology issues that unfortunately everyone, also hit in the past. And eventually we did see the valley of despair. And eventually we did have to kind of go through this. And it was not quite as extensive as maybe those other folks, but it still certainly required pain. And so I think, my learnings on that was, when I think about from a culture perspective, we had a kind of a classic Bay Area SaaS culture, which was really, really strong sales, really, really inclusive, very, very focused on everyone just having a really, I would say, a fairly, a group of folks that are generally focused on the positive things about our business and life. And unfortunately, we had a lot of things that are there's some really hard things we need to talk about. And I found we tried to bring some of the different aspects of the Amazon culture. We hired some other leaders from Amazon, which the Amazon approach is we live and focus on defects. We constantly look at what's wrong every single day and we figure out how to make it better. That was too much. And, in fact, if you talk to folks around the Bay Area, there's definitely a number of former Amazon leaders that have been brought into companies. And a lot of them will say, yeah, it's a tough culture. It's really hard. And it's like, well, why is it tough? And they'll say, oh, because it's really, really, it's really hard and it's a lot of work and it kind of bums people out. And it's like, well, but it's also because it's a relentless focus on the defects and on the problems and fixing those things. And that's kind of what it took for Amazon to survive and do as well as it did. And I found trying to find a way to bring that similar approach, it was tough. I mean, we did, have a lot of success, but that culture certainly didn't work. And so our culture, was a little bit different. I did go through, we didn't talk about Groupon. I did have to go through then my second CEO transition. And when you're hired by a CEO, which typically is a CFO, that's usually how it goes. And then when the CEO is replaced, your job is to first figure out how to partner with that new CEO, knowing that you're kind of their stepchild. You're not really their actual child. You're their stepchild. And are you going to make that relationship work? And so I happen to be a stepchild, so I at least kind of understood some of the principles and approaches on how to make it work. Made it work for the most part at Groupon and at Arm. Same, also kind of made it work, but it's just a different relationship. And so,
that makes sense. What I'm going to say, and this is me talking, if you need all the oars rowing in the same direction, and And I mean, that is the beauty of Amazon, that they're doing that.
Yeah.
And it sounds like that was a little bit of an issue with Splunk, and also made a little bit more challenging because you were the stepchild. Interesting, Jason Child is a stepchild, but whatever. Clearly, based upon your experience, having been at a bunch of companies, you're good at adapting. But still, it sounds like, there's certain challenges where if you can't get everybody rowing in the same direction, at the same cadence, it's tough.
100%. And I would say, in obviously the Splunk ended up selling. And so, obviously to some extent the board had eventually come to a similar realization. So while the company still did well, and it's still, when I joined, it was about a $15 billion valuation. It got to 30 or 40, and I think they sold for just shy of 30. So still overall, generally went well. I think we about doubled the business in the time frame that I was there, and went from a very, almost no cloud to a couple $1 billion cloud business. So we had a lot of success in those regards. But I would say relative to the potential, yeah, we didn't realize our potential. And I would say, yes, to the or concept, I used to kind of think of, if you were to go ask the average people and get a very truthful answer, for rank the following, how would you rank customers, company, department, function, self? Where would you rate those things in terms of importance and how you prioritize your time? At Amazon, you'll get the same answer from 99% of people. At Splunk and some other companies I've worked at that have had challenges, you will get different answers on that prioritization.
And that's hard. I mean, I'm sure being an analyst is a very tough job. But I do think that some of these people who look from the outside, and their nose isn't really under the tent. I think these things about the true chemistry are underappreciated by forecasters. And I mean, these are, you can have very, very large organizations, but when there's internal conflict, or, you just have different philosophies, and you can't really come to consensus, and people execute on that consensus, look what it can do to companies.
Yeah. No, I like organizations and what makes them work, and cultures, and how it's fascinating because, for the most part, some of the most successful businesses, the CEOs are probably best described as fascist dictators. And I won't give names, but you can think of a couple of really, really popular, successful companies in the Bay Area, especially, maybe even in, the Northwest, that got to their size because of that type of leadership. And over time, I would say there's probably less tolerance for that type of leadership today, which is probably why some of those companies had some of the changes they've had. But it is really fascinating because I almost wonder, could you build some of these companies today, with just how the world and how employees are going to be motivated, and how they're going to take direction, and how you're going to build a culture and go take on some really, really, almost impossible tasks. Those are fascinating. That ultimately is what makes business so fascinating. It is an art, and it's so interesting to see how companies deal with this.
No. We're very like-minded about this. And it's one of the reasons on this show why I like to bring people on who talk about culture and leadership, and why, obviously with your experience, you do have a blue chip resume. Is there a chip above blue chip? I don't remember anymore, but you have a pretty good resume. So thanks for tuning in. If you want more info on the show, please visit blockandtackleshow.com. And you can also email me at Karl@blockandtackleshow.com. Thanks for tuning in.